these battleground states are. And today, Donald Trump took his election-denying, xenophobic, apocalyptic stump speech to Michigan and Wisconsin, where there's a presidential primary tonight, by the way. Our first guest tonight will be Michigan's Democratic Governor, Gretchen Whitmer, who will join me in just a moment. Trump started his day with an anti-immigration screed in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where the Democratic National Committee launched a new billboard.
They tried to use that term incorrectly on me 2 weeks ago. You know, it's all about misinformation. If we don't win on November 5th, I think our country is going to cease to exist.
Now, this is not the first time that Donald Trump has predicted that the United States will cease to exist if he loses. What could cease to exist in this country if Donald Trump wins is the right to an abortion, even in states where it is currently legal, even in states where the Constitution of that state guarantees it. Donald Trump has teased a 15-week federal abortion ban, and today he announced that his presidential campaign will release more details about his abortion policy. Now, this news comes after the Florida Supreme Court allowed that state's 6-week abortion ban to take effect. 6 weeks. But in a separate decision, the court will allow Florida voters to decide in November whether to expand reproductive rights in that state. Biden's campaign manager, Julie Chavez Rodriguez, told reporters today, quote, Donald Trump is directly to blame for the fact that abortion has now been effectively banned across the entire southeastern United States, end quote. And today, NBC News broke the story that Arizona abortion rights advocates say they've gathered signatures needed to put a constitutional amendment on the 2024 ballot to protect abortion access up to viability. Meanwhile, Michigan Democrats are expanding reproductive freedoms for Michiganders. And our next guest, the Michigan Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer, signed into law yesterday a series of bills known collectively as the Michigan Family Protection Act, which provides legal protections for families whose children were born via in vitro fertilization. The legislation also ended Michigan's criminal ban on paid surrogacy. Protecting reproductive freedom and choice was a promise that Governor Whitmer has kept since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade.
As minority leader, I urged my colleagues to take the floor and express their outrage and share their stories. And one of them was about to, but he couldn't because it was too difficult. And that's when I realized, how could I ask a colleague to tell their story when I wasn't yet prepared to share my own? So I took to the podium and put aside my prepared remarks and shared the story that I'd only told a handful of people. I talked about the time that I was raped when I was in college. Thankfully, it did not result in a pregnancy, but if it had, I knew that I would have been able to get the care that I needed, that was right for me. I knew that in Michigan, I could do what I needed to do if it came to that. The decision about my future would be mine alone. The bill we were debating at the time would have forced me to buy insurance for my own rape before it happened, or to bear the child of my attacker. 10 years ago today, I gave that speech, and it didn't change a single vote on the Senate floor. Hundreds of people called and faxed and emailed my office to share their support or to share their own story. I knew then that this fight was not over. Today, exactly 10 years later, I'm honored to stand here as the governor and sign the repeal of that awful law. And I share this story because it reminds us all that when we work to protect our fundamental rights, our reproductive rights, civil rights, LGBTQ+ rights, sometimes that work takes longer than days or weeks. Sometimes maybe it takes a decade and it's still not truly finished. But staying in that fight is the only way to win that fight.
Joining us now is the Michigan Governor, Gretchen Whitmer. She is the co-chair of the Biden-Harris 2024 re-election campaign. Governor, it's good to see you again. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Allie. Good to be with you.
A number of states, including Florida, are trying to get ballot measures like you had in Michigan through to guarantee abortion rights in their state. What happens if Donald Trump's threat or promise, depending on how you see it, to impose a 15-week abortion ban comes to pass? Does that have
and what may happen in Arizona. Let's be very clear. Abortion is on the ballot in all 50 states in this election. If Donald Trump becomes our president again, he is going to eviscerate many fundamental freedoms, including the right to abortion. And it would impact women in Michigan, New York, California, and every other state like Ohio that has achieved, protections for this right.
And in the last election in your state, you and your fellow statewide Democrats leaned into that as an issue, and other issues, obviously. It is the prototype, perhaps, for what can happen across this country in November.
Absolutely. Allie, I had to tell my story about being sexually assaulted when I was at Michigan State in undergrad 10 years ago, when I was fighting an effort to make it even harder for women to access abortion. It didn't change a single vote that day, but I knew after the response that I heard from people across Michigan that we were right on this issue. 10 years later, to the day, I was able to sign the repeal of that very law. This is a fight we women in America and our families and our allies are ready to have. We shouldn't have to. It is horrifying that we are in this moment, but I don't think anyone should underestimate American women and how strongly we and men and allies across this country feel about this issue, and we are going to win on it.
One of the things you did in that speech a decade ago when you were the minority leader in the Senate, you said you don't like talking about this that much, but you wanted people to see who the women were on the other side of the story, on the other side of the equation. And we have learned that since the fall of Roe, right? These abstractions about women who get abortions have now become real stories about women who are actually dying in the effort to have reproductive health care.
Well, that's right. And when I told that story, it didn't sway a single vote that day. And sadly, as I just signed into law, this repeal of the ban on paid surrogacy in Michigan, we want to help women and their families, same-sex couples as well, start a family in whatever way makes sense for them, on their own terms, when they're ready. We can protect all of those rights. But this bill that I just signed into law yesterday only had 2 Republicans vote in favor of it. This is the same group of people that said, oh, we all support IVF when the Alabama ruling came out. But then when they had a vote in front of them to protect IVF and to protect surrogacy, they voted no. And so that's why I keep saying, watch what people do. Don't listen to what they say. Watch what they do, and they'll tell you who they are.
The IVF issue in Alabama, and I'm glad you have straightened this out in Michigan, but it confused many of us because we didn't really understand what's this about? Why are people against IVF? Most people just think IVF is difficult and expensive and hard to achieve, but it helps people who are trying to have children. What does your law in Michigan now protect against?
Well, so we have secured and made very clear what the rights are and codified IVF, as well as decriminalized paid surrogacy. I think those were 2 very important ways that many people create families, and we want to ensure that if you want to have a family, you're ready to have it, you've got all the avenues to do exactly that. If an embryo is considered a human being, has rights of a human being, that means, IVF, of course, you saw what happened in Alabama, but it also could extend to embryonic stem cell research. It could ban the cutting edge research for cures when it comes to Alzheimer's or juvenile diabetes. I mean, this is a really scary moment. And if people are really paying attention, you see how broad all of these attacks could be applied. And it is why this fight is so important and why we've all got to be a part of it.
Donald Trump said a lot of things in Michigan that are of interest, including how the country is going to cease to exist if he's not president, and our death to our cities and our suburbs and all this. He also pointed out that suburban housewives love him. He made it very specific. He was talking.
Women and men of this state spoke loud and clear in the last election and sent me back to keep doing this job. And I'll tell you, I think that the conversation around our border is serious. We need serious leaders who are going to try to solve problems. Donald Trump couldn't get it done when he was president. He called me and asked me to send the Michigan National Guard, and we did. We performed some surveillance on the southern border to help him out. He couldn't get it fixed. And so when Joe Biden was on the precipice of working with Congress to finally have some real protections, he's the one that torpedoed it. And so to come into this state and to tell people that he was the one that could have fixed it when it's exactly exactly the opposite. That's why I say you can't listen to what these guys say. You got to look at the record. You got to get the facts. And that's why I appreciate the work that you do.
How do you convince people who may, including in your state, either be complacent about the fact that they've got abortion protections in their state, they've got you as their governor, or aren't in love with everything Joe Biden has been doing? How do you talk to them without minimizing what may be their valid concerns about the fact that the option, if they don't vote for if they don't vote for Joe Biden, or they don't vote at all, is Donald Trump?
Well, I think it's by listening. You know, we got to earn people's votes. The vote is an important thing that someone has that only that person can exercise, and you got to earn that. I think it starts with listening. I think it extends to making sure people have the facts, you know, putting it out there, what really is at stake in this election. You know, I got an organization, fightlikeHell.org, if anyone wants to help, but this work that we're doing is centered around making sure that people understand just because we've made these great strides in Michigan, so proud of that, it can be undone quickly if we get a Trump term where he gets a legislature or a Congress that'll send him an abortion ban. He's already said he's going to sign it. And that's why we can't let people assume that just because you're in a state that affords you these freedoms right now, that they're always going to be intact. We're all at risk in this upcoming presidential election.
What about the movement that we saw, the uncommitted movement during the primaries? Those are people who, when presented with the idea that the binary choice between Donald Trump and Joe Biden should be clear, have responded by saying, but that minimizes my actual concerns. That means that your things that you're worried about are not that important right now. What does listening to them or hearing them look like to you, specifically in Michigan? Because there are a lot of people who came out to cast an uncommitted ballot.
Yeah, there are a lot of people hurting. What is happening in Gaza and Israel, the hostages, as well as the innocent lives that are being lost every single day. It's horrific. And here in Michigan, we've got a huge population that is often 1 degree of separation from people that are suffering or people that are mourning. It is horribly hard. And that's why I think showing up and listening, making sure that we stay focused on solving problems, keeping people safe here at home, and ensuring that they understand all the different things that we are working on to give people a path to a good life here, and to make sure that America is a credible force around the world, a force for good. But no voter is, no group or community is monolithic. We got a lot of work to do, and that's just the very real truth.
Governor Whitmer, good to see you again. Thank you for spending time with us this evening.
Thank you.
All right, coming up, breaking election news. Tonight, Joe Biden is winning the Democratic primary in Wisconsin by a bigger margin than Donald Trump is winning the Republican primary. And earlier today, Donald Trump was there lying about the 2020 presidential election results. Wisconsin Democratic Party Chairman Ben Whitmer joins us next. It's Election Day in Wisconsin. At this hour, with nearly 70% of the vote in, Joe Biden is winning 87% of the Democratic vote, with a little less than 10% of the vote going to uninstructed, which is a protest vote in opposition to the war in Gaza. Donald Trump has 76% of. Earlier tonight, Donald Trump held a rally in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where he once again spread lies about the 2020 election and claimed that he won the state of Wisconsin.
You know, we won this state. We won this state by a lot. And it came out that we won this state, actually.
He didn't win. It didn't come out that he won. That's just a lie. Donald Trump lost the state of Wisconsin in 2020 to President Biden by more than 20,000 votes. Here's what the Wisconsin Secretary of State, Sarah Godlewski, had to say earlier about the former president's return to her state.
You know, today is the first time Trump has been here in almost 2 years. You know why? He's been too busy focusing on himself, whether that's peddling his next gimmick like buying a Bible or $399 sneakers that just working families can't afford, to, you know, being in court because he has 88 criminal charges against him. And as president, Donald Trump didn't do things for working families here in Wisconsin. Let's talk about his tax plan. You know, his tax plan provided tax breaks for the wealthy 1% in corporations. So the Amazons of the world paid basically zero in taxes. And my parents, who are retired public school teachers, paid more. That's not right. We look at his tax cuts alone, they increased the deficit by almost $2 trillion. That's not fiscally responsible.
Joining us now, Ben Wickler, the chairman of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Ben, good to see you again. Thank you for being with us. What do you make of the results? And obviously not the big headlines that Biden won and Trump won, but what do you make of how this is all playing out, the number of people who came out, the enthusiasm, and the fact that Wisconsin, though Joe Biden won, is a tight place?
Well, it's great to be with you, Ellie, tonight. And it's a big night in Wisconsin. I think the core story is kind of shown with what happened in each party in the election day today. Trump was telling his supporters to wait in line to see him speak, and Democrats were asking people to knock on doors all over the state, which we did. We've knocked on hundreds of thousands of doors, phone calls, relational contacts over the last month, tens of thousands of voters we've reached just today to support local candidates, to get out the vote for President Biden. And then you see the results. The Republican Party is divided. They're still in the middle of a civil war about whether we should be a democracy, about who won in 2020 and whether we should acknowledge reality, about national abortion bans, which Trump is teasing that he's about to announce his support for. We don't know exactly what he's going to say. On the Democratic side, there's a clear call for change in the Middle East, the heartbreaking crisis that we're seeing, and a very clear vote of confidence for President Biden. Democrats want to stop Trump. They want another Biden-Harris term. They want to see progress. And that is what most people want. It's not just hardcore Democrats. Most independents, a lot of Republicans, and almost all Democrats want to see us move forward, protect freedom and democracy, move towards peace and justice, and an economy that works for working people and brings down costs, instead of ransacking the national treasury to hand out huge bags of money to the ultra wealthy, which is the Trump way of doing the economy.
So let's divide those two things up. On the one side of things, the abortion, the freedoms, the liberty, the future of the country, democracy, that whole bucket of things in a tight place like Wisconsin. In fact, since the last election, we have seen on the matter of abortion, it worked out differently in Wisconsin than it did in Michigan because it was a judicial election. But we saw people do the same thing that they did in Michigan. When pressed about the issues of liberty and freedom, they chose liberty and freedom, and Donald Trump's on the wrong side of that one.
That's absolutely right. Everywhere where people have had the chance to go to the ballot box and cast a vote for these array of MAGA Republicans running for U.S. Senate, including in Wisconsin, Eric Hovde, who last time he ran supported a total abortion ban in 2012, and life begins at conception, the attacks on IVF that we've seen in Alabama. This is what the Republican Party is putting on offer. And on the other side, as President Biden said in his State of the Union address, you elect a Congress that believes in reproductive freedom, that sends him a bill to put the protections of Roe versus Wade back into place. He will sign that bill, and we will defend reproductive freedom coast to coast, nationwide, in Wisconsin and everywhere else. That is the choice that voters have. However they feel about the candidates, they can make a choice about whether they want the power to make their own decisions about their own lives, or they want Republican politicians to override it. And it's as simple as that.
Let me ask you this, because you're not running for office, so I think you're going to give me a more straight answer than people who are in office running for office. 9.3% of people voted uninstructed. That's 31,800 or 32,000 votes already, and we still have more votes to come in. That's more people who went out and said, I'm not going to support Joe Biden. Now, we don't know if that happens in the election, than Democrats won by in the last election. That's a big number. And Michigan was a big number, too. That's enough to sink Democrats in both states if there isn't a better answer than what Biden's come up with so far. Do you worry about that?
Well, the voters who cast ballots in the uninstructed column, they voted in the Democratic primary. So they're Democrats. They know that Trump is not the answer. and they were voting to send a message about change that they want to see not after the election, but before the election. What they're calling for is what most Americans want, and the president is calling for and working towards, which is an enduring, just peace. That is what people want to see. And when we see the heartbreaking deaths that are happening right now of kids, of aid workers, and the situation with hostages, both for Israel and Palestine, what we need is self-determination and peace and a resolution to the crisis that we see right now. Voters are calling for that change, and they're doing it in the most civic way possible by casting ballots. If you vote in the primary election, you're much more likely to vote in November. So the opportunity now is to create that change, make clear what the values are that the administration, Biden and Harris, are working to advance. And as we see change on the ground, we have the opportunity to come together around that. The contrast will become even clearer with a Trump administration. What they would do in this situation is total disregard for the lives of Palestinian civilians, frankly, for the hostages, for just about anyone else. And that's the contrast that will become more and more clear as we make progress. So this is a call for change. It's a protest vote in the great American tradition of speaking your mind at the ballot box, and it's civic engagement. It's not tuning out from the system. It's getting involved. I think we have a chance to earn all these votes for the Biden-Harris team as we get into November.
Well, I agree with you. I applaud people who will get up and go to the ballot box to make their protest. Ben, great to see you, as always. Thank you, my friend. Ben Wickler is the chairman of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Coming up, the Israeli government is facing widespread condemnation after an airstrike by its military killed 7 aid workers trying to feed the people of Gaza. President Biden said today he is outraged and heartbroken, while one senior UN official said today there is no safe place left in Gaza. We'll go to the region for a live report next. Breaking news now. President Joe Biden has issued a statement on the deaths of humanitarian workers in Gaza at the hands of the Israeli Defense Forces. Quote, I am outraged and heartbroken by the deaths of 7 humanitarian workers from World Central Kitchen, including 1 American in Gaza yesterday. They were providing food to hungry civilians in the middle of a war. They were brave and selfless. Their deaths are a tragedy. Israel has pledged to conduct a thorough investigation into why the aid workers' vehicles were hit by airstrikes. That investigation must be swift. It must bring accountability, and its findings must be made public. The United States will continue to do all we can to deliver humanitarian assistance to Palestinian civilians in Gaza through all available means. I will continue to press Israel to do more to facilitate that aid, and we are pushing hard for an immediate ceasefire as part of a hostage deal. I have a team in Cairo working on this right now, end quote. 43-year-old Zomi Francom, an Australian humanitarian aid worker, was one of the 7 workers killed in Gaza last night.
This is the beautiful, fragrant, aromatic rice that will be served today from Dinabala Kitchen. Thank you.
World Central Kitchen says Zomi and the 6 other workers had just unloaded 100 tons of humanitarian food aid when their convoy was attacked by the IDF. Chef Jose Andres, the founder of World Central Kitchen, released this statement, quote, World Central Kitchen lost several of our sisters and brothers in an IDF airstrike in Gaza. I'm heartbroken and grieving for their families and friends, and it needs to start now, end quote. Today, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded to the attack, saying the IDF, quote, unintentionally hit innocent people in the Gaza Strip. This happens in war, and we will do everything so that this thing does not happen again, end quote. Today at a White House press briefing, Andrew Feinberg, White House correspondent for The Independent, pressed the National Security Communications Advisor, John Kirby, for an explanation on what Netanyahu calls the unintentional strike.
You described the strike as a possible mistake by Israel. According to Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, it wasn't 1 strike, but 3. The first one, then an interval during which aid workers got out of their vehicles, removed the wounded, tried to move to another vehicle which was struck, and then a 3rd strike as they tried to move and escape in a 3rd vehicle, at which point all of them were dead. How would the 2nd and 3rd strikes of these marked vehicles be a mistake? And why would the U.S. not more forcefully set conditions on the use of U.S.-made weaponry when it is being used to target aid workers. If the first one was a mistake, the second two were targeted with the intent of killing everyone in that convoy. So how do you respond to that?
First of all, there's an investigation going on. So why don't we let it get done, and why don't we see what they find in terms of the decision-making process that led to this terrible outcome? Prime Minister and the IDF have noted that it was their error. If you don't like the word mistake, their error. They're investigating it. Let them do that work, and let them see what they come up with, and then we'll go from there.
Joining us now from Jerusalem is the journalist Noga Tarnopolsky. She has spent over 2 decades covering the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Noga, good to see you, my friend. This comes in the context of a lot of things that are happening in Israel right now, including increased protests, a situation you've been covering this for almost 2 years now, including protests that involved hostage families, and then, of course, this deep tragedy. Give me a sense of what's happening and what you're hearing where you are.
Well, there's a feeling of kind of unreality here right now. This tragedy today involves an organization that nobody has any doubts about. It's not like one of the UN agencies that Israel accuses of having been in cahoots, let's say, with Hamas in Gaza. Nobody has any doubts whatsoever about what Chef Jose Andres' World Central Kitchen is doing there. And in fact, this is an organization that came and brought food to Israelis initially after the Hamas attack. So it seems to have changed somehow whatever Israeli ambivalence there was about the lack of information coming out of Gaza to Israelis. We saw tonight a massive anti-war rally in Jerusalem. I think there's no other way to describe it. Anti-Netanyahu, anti-war, and pro-bringing the hostages home at any cost. The Israeli government feels very threatened by these protests, and for now there's no movement. I have to say there's no movement on either side. Hamas is not accepting a hostage exchange, just like the Israeli government also isn't.
Yes, that was why it was interesting when Joe Biden made that reference. So I've got people in Cairo working on it right now, as if there's a potential breakthrough. It would be a surprise to all of us if that were the case. But you bring up something interesting, because the anti-Netanyahu protests have been going on for a very, very long time, more than a year before October 7th. They weren't always the same as anti-war protests. It's not always the same people. The
families and Netanyahu that left the families feeling completely betrayed. And so they shifted tactics, and they announced publicly that they were doing so. And one of the fathers of a hostage came right out and said to Netanyahu, "You forced us into the arms of the protest. You've made us one." So you're absolutely right. The families of hostages have spent the last 6 months now just basically begging to get their loved ones home. And they now feel, and they've said openly, that they feel the Israeli prime minister is an obstacle to that aim. And so they have joined explicitly the anti-Netanyahu protest movement, and they've given a kind of new fuel to this movement. There were 100,000 people surrounding the Knesset. Remember, this is mid-war with a very depressed population here. 100,000 people around the Knesset Sunday night. There's a tent city around the Knesset right now. This is a week-long protest. The government doesn't seem to be reacting, but there is a feeling of a public shift.
Interesting. No, because I cover terrible things like hurricanes and disasters, and I've run into Jose or his people from World Central Kitchen all around the world, but often they are there as an adjunct. They're there as an extra support. The problem in Gaza is that a number of aid agencies have now ceased their work while they evaluate the security situation, but it's not like there's an alternative. The Israelis don't operate from a food distribution perspective in Gaza. Hamas doesn't now operate as a food distribution mechanism in Gaza. This is becoming this famine is becoming very real.
Absolutely. And I don't know what to call what happened, but the catastrophe of last night, and to be frank, 24 hours later, or more than now, 25 hours later, the lack of a coherent Israeli response is leaving Israel stranded as the only party responsible for what is happening in Gaza. The Israeli attempt to bring in international organizations to allow, for example, the UAE to do airdrops, and then the US and Jordan. Apparently, what I have heard today is that Israel wanted the World Central Kitchen to have some kind of permanent role distributing aid inside Gaza. We're kind of counting on them for the future. Obviously, all of that has been blown up by this disaster, and I think Israel's going to be left having to make very, very difficult decisions in a matter of days.
Yeah, it's a logistical issue, and if you needed someone to take that over, you would talk to Jose Andres, because they're particularly good at that, but it's a weird situation. Noga, thanks as always for adding your analysis and your great reporting to this. Noga Tarnopolsky joining us from Jerusalem. All right, coming up, will Judge Aileen Cannon help Donald Trump avoid a criminal trial for possession of classified and other government documents before the election? Andrew Weissman and Brad Moss join us to discuss that next. Special counsel Jack Smith and Donald Trump have until midnight tonight to respond to an order from Judge Aileen Cannon with their proposed jury instructions in the criminal case against Donald Trump for his alleged illegal retention of classified documents and his obstruction of efforts by the government to get them back. Judge Cannon has already said she's considering giving an instruction to jurors that is essentially Donald Trump's defense in the case. Quote, a president has sole authority under the Presidential Records Act to categorize records as personal or presidential during his or her presidency, end quote. Judge Cannon has yet to rule on new proposed dates for the trial to begin, fueling concerns that Jack Smith's proposed July start might not happen. In a paperless order today, Judge Cannon was clearer in her paperless order that the classified documents case was never going to trial before the election, end quote. Joining us now, Andrew Weissman, former FBI general counsel and former chief of the criminal division in the Eastern District of New York. He's an MSNBC legal analyst and the co-author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Trump Indictments, the Historic Charging Documents with Commentary. And Bradley Moss is a national security attorney who represents people who work in the intelligence community. Good evening to both of you. We have a lot of ground to cover. Bradley, I wanted to start with you because you deal very specifically in matters of documents and top secret stuff and classified matters. This thing about letting the jury consider the idea that the president has the right to determine what is a presidential record or not. I don't know much about this, but I didn't think that was actually really a thing. I didn't think you could sort of give the jury an option to make that determination.
No, it's not a thing. You're not alone on that front. That is a strict question of law. If Judge Cannon believes there's some legitimacy to that argument, and that's something Donald Trump has been outlining in his pretrial motions, then she should grant one of his pretrial motions to throw out the indictment and let this go up to the 11th Circuit on appeal. That's a strict question of law. The issue, in fact, would be whether or not the information was national defense information, if Donald Trump was in possession of it without authorization, and if he tried to conceal it when confronted by the government. Those are the questions that would be relevant when it comes to an Espionage Act charge. I don't know where she was possibly going with this proposed jury instruction, other than the idea that she just doesn't want to have to take, the responsibility of making these decisions and having her name on that opinion that rules against Donald Trump on that. Beyond that, I'm baffled.
Right. All right. Andrew Weissman, take a shot at it. What do you make of what that was all about?
I think that the judge is completely in the bag for Donald Trump. I think the proposal that she gave for two people, both sides to sort of address an issue, both options that she set forth are wrong, are legally wrong. And so the filing today is going to be fascinating because the real issue is the government going to view this as the Rubicon, where they are going to be putting a line in the sand saying, you know what, if this is where you're going, if you were saying that you're going to give one of these two wrong instructions, both being wrong, we are going to appeal you. We're either going to do it by an appeal, we're going to do it by what's called a writ of mandamus, but we've had it. We're sort of done. And so I'm fascinated to see whether they think this is it. They're kind of done with her because to Bradley's point, the reason he is saying he's baffled is because there is no law to support what she's doing. That we are in the same situation pre-trial where the 11th Circuit reversed this judge not once, but twice. And so the fascinating thing in the next hour is we're going to learn sort of what the DOJ's view is in terms of how significant they think this is.
So, Bradley, let's take that thesis a little further. Maybe she's in the bag for Trump. Andrew makes the point. She has been corrected by the 11th Circuit a couple times. So you're right. She could send it up and see what happens. But what are the implications of her being in the bag for Trump? Because right now the most serious one seems to be she might make mistakes in how she instructs the jury, how she deals with things, but that might be appealed. The issue here is, will this trial see the light of day before the election?
It's getting really hard to imagine how this is going to happen before the election at this point, if for no other reason than she's just taking her sweet time more than anyone I can imagine. Finally does set a new trial date, but at this point I would not be shocked if she says I'm pushing this off until sometime in spring 2025.
Andrew, you're a TV expert, so you can do this in 60 seconds because that's all the time I have. But you argue that she's justifying her sluggishness.
Yeah, I think I'm with Bradley. I think that she is going to point out that she has not violated the Speedy Trial Act. I think she's anticipating that the government may try to go up to the 11th Circuit and that they're going to try and force either a change of judge or to get a trial date set. And she is going to try to create a record that she hasn't been delaying this case and she's been complying with the Speedy Trial Act. That's the only way I can sort of understand her latest paperless order asking for this information from the defense, which seems totally unnecessary. So, I mean, you have an erratic, inexperienced judge who seems quite partisan and making rulings that seem almost unilaterally in favor of one side. So I would say keep your eye on this filing in terms of whether DOJ has had it.
Guys, thanks very much. Andrew Weissman and Bradley Moss. We'll be right back. And that is tonight's last word. The 11th hour with Stephanie Ruhle begins right now.